The last interesting type I want to show in this module is the never type. Now we saw a function that returned void, so that never returns anything. Never is another type functions can return. And that might sound strange. Let's have a look at how it works. Let's say we have a function generate error. Here I expect to get a message, which is a string, and maybe some error code, which might be a number. Now inside of this function, let's say, we throw an error. So this should essentially be a utility function that generates error objects and throws them. So here we might throw an object, which we can do in JavaScript. We can throw any object or any value as an error. And that should have a message property in which I store the value of my message argument here. And I want to have an error code property, let's say, where I store the code argument in. So now this would be a valid function, and we can call this with an error occurred, for example, and a code of 500. If we do that and we compile this file here, we see that once this reloads, we get our error, well, as an error here. And this might sound pretty abstract, but actually it isn't. Having utility functions like this would be pretty standard in bigger applications where you don't manually want to throw an error in 10 different places of your app, but where you want to reach out to one convenient function that builds the error object for you and maybe also throws it immediately, so that you can call this function with different inputs, but you always have an error being thrown. Now the interesting thing about this function is it does not just return void. I actually can specify that it returns void, because of course it returns nothing, but actually it does not just return nothing. If we're totally honest, this function returns never. This function never produces a return value. If I would try to store the return value here, and I console log result, and I then compile my code and this executes, we see there is no undefined being logged here, because since an error is thrown, this essentially crashes our script, you could say. It cancels our script. And this will always be the case for this function. Of course, we can wrap it in try catch so that we can still continue in the script, but this function essentially never produces a value. This function always crashes the script or this part of the script if you're using try catch, and therefore never returns anything. And hence the return type of this function actually is not just void, but also never. Now the interesting thing is, if you hover over it without assigning never, you see the inferred type is void. Also because never is a newer type. It's been around for some time now, but it wasn't built into the first versions of TypeScript. And therefore void is typically assumed, and it's not horrible to leave it at that. But you can be very clear and explicitly set never as the return type to make it really clear that this never returns anything. So from a code quality perspective, this might be clearer regarding your intentions and make it really clear to other developers reading your code that this function is intended to never return anything and to essentially crash or break your script or that part of the script. Another function that would never return, by the way, would be a function with an infinite loop. So if we have while true in there, that creates an infinite loop, and that therefore also would be a function that never returns. The error function here, or the function that generates and throws an error, probably is the more common use case though. So never, also an interesting type which you can use on functions for cases like this one here.